Camille Ashworth Vane wore a diamond on her finger as big as a warning, and owned a voice that could freeze a warm room solid. So when the waitress spilled a single drop of wine near her sleeve, the fiancé of the most dangerous man in Chicago decided to make the girl into a lesson. In flawless, ice-cold Parisian French, certain a busboy's daughter couldn't possibly follow a word of it, Camille smiled at the whole table of silk and gold and said, "Look at the creature they fished out of the sewer to wait on us. Something even the garbage forgot to haul away." The table roared with laughter, and Della Rourke, 27, with a burn scar running the length of her left forearm and her late father's handwritten dictionary tucked into her apron, went utterly still. She'd already been fired that night. Her little brother's hospital deposit was due at the end of the week and she couldn't cover it. She had nothing left to lose, and that, as it turned out, was the most dangerous thing a woman could ever carry into a room like that. She raised her tired gray eyes, corrected Camille's grammar in that same razor-sharp French, then stripped the woman's character bare in the fast, biting street Italian of the Naples docks, and finished with an old Russian proverb, soft as a knife sliding home, gold on the outside, rotten wood within. The room fell as silent as a breath held too long. And at the head of the table, Rafael Castellanos, the man who ruled half the city's shadows and hadn't so much as glanced up from his phone all evening, finally lifted his dark eyes to the woman nobody was ever supposed to notice. If you love slow burn stories where the overlooked one finally finds her voice, tap that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to where it all began. 6 hours before she brought a room full of powerful people to silence. 6 hours earlier, far from the crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive perfume, an attic apartment nestled beneath the sloping roof of an old building on the western edge of the city, where cold air slipped through a window frame patched with tape, and the room's only desk lamp cast a weak yellow glow that felt like a weary word of comfort. Della Rourke knelt on the worn rug beside the small bed, pulling the faded plaid blanket more securely around her little brother's shoulders, while Toby, 8 years old, looked up at her with the bright, shining eyes of a child who had never learned to doubt the world. The dictionary lay between them like a treasure, its leather cover cracked, its thick yellowed pages crowded with the handwriting of a man who was no longer alive. It was the only thing Della had managed to save from everything they had lost. And every night, when the streets outside disappeared into darkness, she opened it the way someone might open a door leading back into the past. "Read me the page with the fox, Della," Toby whispered, his voice slightly hoarse, and she knew exactly which one he meant, the page where their father had carefully written a French proverb about the fox and the grapes, adding a note in his slanting handwriting along the margin that what we cannot reach, we often claim is sour. Della turned to that page, her finger brushing across the faded ink, and as she read, their father's voice seemed to rise again within every syllable, warm and unhurried, the same voice that had once soothed her to sleep in cold rented rooms across Marseille, Napoli, and St. Petersburg, places where her childhood had passed among towers of books and the sounds of foreign languages that had slowly become familiar. Toby loved it most when she translated a sentence into all 3 languages, letting him hear the same thought dressed in 3 different garments of sound, and he would giggle and say that Russian sounded like stones rolling down a hill, while Italian sounded like someone arguing over love. Della would laugh with him, and in that moment, the poor apartment, with a basin catching water beneath the leaking ceiling and a pair of torn shoes drying beside the heater, suddenly became the warmest place in the world. She reached for the small inhaler resting on the bedside table, the one Toby always needed close by each night, and gently reminded him to use it before going to sleep, her voice calm, as though it were merely another tender part of their routine, and not the quiet reminder of a fear that never truly left her. Toby obediently did as she asked, then burrowed deeper beneath the blanket, his eyelids already beginning to droop. "Della," he murmured. "Did Dad ever write words that nobody could read?" Della went still. She knew what he meant. Near the final pages of the dictionary, hidden among the ordinary notes, there were several strange lines their father had written in symbols that resembled no language she knew. Russian letters mixed with slashes and brief numerical codes, almost like a puzzle. When she was little, she had asked him about them, and he had only smiled, stroked her hair, and told her they were a secret game meant only for the 2 of them, that one day, when she was old enough, she would solve it on her own, and she had believed it was simply the kind of thing a loving father invented to make lonely evenings feel less empty. "It was Dad's game," she answered softly, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "One day, I'll be able to read it to you." At that moment, She had no idea that those meaningless lines would one day become the most dangerous thing she had ever touched. Toby smiled, satisfied with her promise, and drifted into sleep, his breathing gradually becoming steady, his small face relaxing in the yellow light. Della remained there for a long time, watching him sleep, one hand still resting lightly on the dictionary as though, through it, she were holding the hands of both her father and her mother. She thought of her Russian mother, with wheat-colored hair and sorrowful lullabies, and of her father, with his stubborn belief that people would stop hurting one another if only they were willing to understand each other's words. She thought about where that belief had led them, and her throat tightened. But she wouldn't allow herself to cry. Not tonight. Not when so many things were still waiting for her beyond those walls. She bent down and kissed her brother's forehead, wrapping the promise inside her heart the way one might shield a candle from the wind, then rose quietly and pulled her thin coat around her shoulders. The clock on the wall told her it was time to leave for work, and somewhere else in the city, inside a ballroom she couldn't yet begin to imagine. Fate had already arranged the board and was waiting for her to step into the game. Mrs. Kowalski from the apartment across the hall was already waiting outside when Della gently pulled the door closed, and the elderly woman with trembling hands merely nodded, a nod that had become a private language between them after so many nights. A quiet promise that she would leave her door open and listen closely to the room next door until Della returned at daybreak. Della pressed a scrap of paper with the hospital's phone number into her hand in case anything happened, reminded her where Toby's inhaler was kept, then started down the dark staircase, each step creaking beneath her feet as though it were grieving on her behalf. Outside, the Chicago night wind sliced through her thin coat as though it weren't there at all, and she lowered her head and hurried toward the train station, both hands buried deep in her pockets, where the dictionary still rested, its familiar weight pressing against her side like a reminder of who she was and everything she had sacrificed to reach this place. There was a bitter irony she had learned to swallow long ago, that a person who could read and write fluently in French, Italian, Russian, and English, a person who had once translated complicated letters for her father in rented attic rooms across Europe, couldn't find a respectable job as a translator in this city, simply because she didn't have a single diploma to prove what she knew. Every company whose door she knocked on was equally polite and equally cold. They asked where she had studied, which school she had graduated from, whether she held any certifications. And when she explained that she had learned from her father, learned through their travels, learned by living among those languages, they only gave her the carefully practiced smile reserved for rejection and said they were very sorry, but they needed paperwork, they needed credentials, they needed something bearing an official seal that she would never possess. The examinations required to earn certification cost money and took time, two luxuries she couldn't afford, because her time belonged to Toby and her money belonged to the bills that never stopped arriving. So in the end she chose to work the night shift waiting tables at a restaurant, not because the work was worthy of her abilities, but because it placed cash directly into her hand and left her daylight hours free to take her brother to his appointments, to sit beside his bed, and to be the sister she had once promised herself she would become. She thought of the money hanging over her head like a blade, the deposit the hospital needed before the end of the week to hold Toby's place for the new round of treatment, a figure that made her heart sink every time she added it up in her mind, because even if she combined every dollar of wages, every tip, and every loose coin hidden in the tin box on top of the cabinet, she would still be short, so terribly short that the road ahead seemed completely sealed off. She had calculated everything, had cut their expenses down to the bone, had skipped more meals than she would ever dare admit, yet the numbers kept returning the same merciless answer, and she knew that if she couldn't find the money before the end of the week, that treatment slot would be lost, and she couldn't bring herself to think about what might come after that. Lost in those dark calculations, she nearly walked past the man curled up against the wall near the entrance to the station, a familiar figure wrapped in an old, torn blanket, someone she saw every night on her way to work and had come to recognize so well that he seemed almost like part of the street itself. Della stopped. In her coat pocket was a sandwich she had carefully packed that afternoon, the only food she had set aside for herself during the long night ahead, and her empty stomach was already twisting with hunger. She stood there for a moment, a brief moment of struggle between her own hunger and the exhausted eyes of the man looking up at her. Then she bent down, placed the sandwich in his calloused hand, and gently closed his fingers around it as though she were afraid of breaking something fragile. "It's terribly cold tonight. Please keep yourself warm," she said softly, and the man looked at her with a speechless, astonished gratitude. the gaze of someone who hadn't been treated like a human being in a very long time. She didn't believe she had done anything noble. She had only done what her father surely would have done, what her own heart wouldn't allow her to ignore, even though she herself was barely keeping her balance at the edge of an abyss. Then she raised the collar of her coat, descended the steps into the earth, and let the roar of the train swallow her whole, carrying her toward an evening she believed would be nothing more than another ordinary shift among hundreds of others, never knowing that it would be the night her life turned onto an entirely different path. The train stopped at a transfer station, and when the doors slid open, a strange current of air drifted inside, carrying the scorched smell of something burning at some late-night restaurant above ground, and that alone, that single accidental breath of faint smoke, was enough to wrench Della out of the present and send her falling straight back into the night she had spent all the years since trying to forget, yet had never been able to escape. She closed her eyes, but closing them only made the memory clearer. That winter night when she wasn't yet 23, when her family had just moved into the aging apartment her father said they would occupy only temporarily, and she remembered how strange he had seemed throughout the week before it happened, more restless than usual, often standing beside the window and staring down at the street for long stretches of time, startling whenever someone knocked at the door, clutching the leather briefcase filled with papers as though it contained something more precious than his own life. At the time, she had dismissed it. She had told herself it was merely the suspicion of a man who had lived through too much turmoil, the anxious caution of an aging scholar, and she hadn't asked, hadn't pressed him for answers, a silence for which she would later pay with the rest of her life. Toby was only a tiny boy then, and by some mercy, a mercy so profound that every time Della thought of it afterward she had to press a hand against her chest to keep herself from breaking apart. He had been sent downstairs to stay with the kind-hearted neighbor, while Della and her parents finished unpacking the cardboard boxes, so when everything happened, he was somewhere safe, sleeping soundly in another person's arms, unaware that his entire world was about to collapse. Della was in the courtyard, struggling to carry a box of books in from the moving truck, when she heard the sharp crack of an explosion from the floor above, and then a fierce orange-red light flared behind the window of their apartment, and for one endless moment she stood frozen, the box slipping from her hands, the books spilling across the snow like broken-winged birds. Then she ran. She couldn't remember how she climbed those stairs. She only remembered the heat striking her face like a wall, remembered the sound of her father calling her mother's name from somewhere inside the sea of flames, remembered throwing herself forward, screaming, reaching into the smoke as though she could tear it apart with her bare hands and find them, and the fire licking across her left forearm, biting into her flesh with a wound she would carry for the rest of her life like the branded seal of grief. She had almost reached the door of the innermost room, close enough to believe that only a few more steps would take her there. But then the powerful arms of a firefighter closed around her waist, yanked her backward, and dragged her out of the burning apartment while she fought, scratched, screamed, and begged them to let her go back inside, to give her just a little more time, only a little. But time was the one thing that night refused to give her. They carried her out into the snow, and she collapsed to her knees on the frozen ground, watching her home blaze like an enormous torch against the darkness, knowing her parents were still inside, knowing she had been right there, so close to them, and still hadn't been able to save them. The scar running along her forearm, the one she had hidden beneath her sleeves for all those years, wasn't the mark of an accident. It was the mark of the moment she hadn't reached them in time. Permanent proof carved into her skin that she had tried, that she had run into the fire, and that she had still failed. They told her it had been an electrical short circuit, a tragic accident for which no one was to blame, and for years she had tried to force herself to believe that comforting explanation, tried to bury the faint, persistent feeling that something wasn't right, that her father's restlessness during his final days had concealed something she had never been allowed to know. She had pushed the thought away, called it the obsession of a broken heart clinging to anything that might spare it from accepting the senselessness of loss. The warning chime announcing that the train doors were about to close pulled her back into the present, and Della's eyes flew open, her heart pounding, her palms soaked with cold sweat. She drew a deep breath, forced the memory back into the place where she had kept it imprisoned, and stepped out of the train, never knowing that within only a few hours, the truth she had buried for so long would begin rising from beneath the ashes. Syrian occupied the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the dark expanse of the lake, a place where merely stepping through the revolving door was enough to make Della feel smaller, like a stray blot of ink on a page of immaculate white paper. She went around to the employee's entrance, changed into the black uniform that had begun to fray at the cuffs, tied her dark brown hair neatly at the nape of her neck, and stepped into the glittering world where she was always present, yet never truly seen. At Syrian, people like her were part of the scenery rather than human beings. They were the hands that poured wine, the shadows that cleared plates, the names no one cared to remember, and tonight that was truer than ever, because the entire restaurant had been reserved for a private celebration, the engagement party of the Castellanos family, a name even the waitstaff dared speak only in whispers tinged with caution and fear. The grand dining room was flooded with candlelight and white orchids, filled with tailored suits and evening gowns, worth an entire year of Della's rent, with controlled laughter and the delicate chime of crystal glasses, all of it forming an atmosphere that was luxurious yet cold, beautiful yet lifeless. Like a garden trimmed so perfectly that nothing living remained, Della had been assigned to serve the main table, where the most important guests were seated, and she moved among them as quietly as a shadow, pouring wine, replacing plates, lowering her head, making herself invisible in precisely the way they expected her to be. At the head of the table sat a man slightly apart from the crowd, his broad shoulders framed by a dark suit, his black hair touched with a few strands of silver at the temples, and throughout the evening he hardly bothered to look up, his eyes fixed on the screen of his phone with a weariness so deep it seemed to reach the bottom of him, as though all the splendor surrounding him were nothing more than a burden he had to endure until it was over. Beside him, the woman everyone in the room gathered around and praised shone in an entirely different way, with a carefully polished, cutting beauty, a smile that always appeared in exactly the right measure, and whenever her gaze swept across the serving staff, it carried the faint disgust of someone who had discovered an insect in her soup. Della had worked enough parties like this to recognize that kind of person from the very first glance, and she had been careful, had kept her distance, had done everything properly, but people like that didn't need her to make a mistake before punishing her. They only needed an excuse. That excuse came when Della tilted the bottle to refill the woman's glass, and at the very moment the red wine touched the rim, the woman suddenly nudged her elbow, a movement so slight that no one noticed it, yet enough to send a single drop spilling onto the pristine white tablecloth. Then she cried out, her falsely shrill voice cutting through the music, complaining that this clumsy girl had nearly ruined her dress, demanding to know where anyone could have found such a careless employee. The manager appeared at once, his face drained of color, bending deeply as he apologized to the honored guest, and without bothering to hear a single word from Della, he seized her by the elbow and pulled her into a corner, whispering in a voice filled with both fury and fear that she had gone too far this time, that he couldn't allow a mistake like that to happen in front of people like these, and that once her shift ended tonight, she didn't need to come back. Della stood there, listening as each word fell like a cold stone, and the strange thing was that she didn't feel angry, didn't feel the urge to argue. She only felt a vast emptiness rising inside her, because what filled her mind wasn't the job she had just lost, but Toby's face, the money hanging over her head, and yet another door slamming shut. She nodded, so faintly it was almost imperceptible, then returned to the dining room to finish the final hours of a job that was no longer hers. And it was then, when she had reached the bottom of a night that couldn't possibly grow worse, when she truly had nothing left to lose, that the woman spoke again, this time in smooth, cutting French, uttering words she was certain the shabby little waitress standing before her would never understand. Della stepped out of the glass tower sometime after midnight, and the cold of the late-night street struck her differently now than it had when she arrived, because a fear was growing inside her chest, slowly and undeniably real, tightening around her with every step that carried her farther from the lights. What had she done? The question spun through her mind, not as some vague accusation against herself, but as a cold calculation of what was about to come, because she understood exactly whom she had just challenged. The woman she had humiliated before an entire room filled with powerful people wasn't merely a difficult guest. She was the future bride of the Castellanos family, a woman about to enter the ranks of those whose names made the entire city hold its breath, and someone like her would never forgive a person who had made her lose face so publicly. Della wasn't afraid for her dignity. In the eyes of people like them, she had no dignity left to protect. She was afraid for things far more tangible, things with names and ages. She had just lost her job, the serving position she had clung to like a plank in a raging current, and now that plank had been torn from her hands, leaving her struggling in open water. Without that job, there would be no cash at the end of each shift, no tips hastily tucked into the pocket of her apron, No small but steady lifeline that both she and Toby depended on to survive from one day to the next. And the money hanging over her head, the hospital deposit due before the end of the week to hold her brother's place for treatment, had now gone from difficult to nearly impossible, because she hadn't been able to gather enough even while she still had the job, much less now. She stopped beside a street lamp and leaned against the freezing metal pole, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. What could a woman like Camille Ashworth Vane do to someone as invisible as her? She could make a single phone call and have the name Della Rourke placed on the blacklist of every respectable restaurant in the city, ensuring that no one would ever dare hire her again. She could do far worse, the kinds of things that families like the Castellanos were known to do to anyone who stood in their way, things Della didn't dare let her imagination follow any further. And if something happened to her, what would become of Toby, that 8-year-old boy with fragile lungs and a smile that trusted the whole world? The thought made her knees threaten to give way. She had no one else. No father, no mother, no relative close enough to take in a sick child. Only herself, standing alone between him and a world ready to swallow the weak. For one reckless moment, she had allowed years of buried pride to erupt in a handful of sentences, and now she had to face the cost of that moment, a price that perhaps wouldn't be paid by her, but by her brother. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked hard and forced them back, because crying was another luxury she couldn't afford. She pulled the dictionary from her pocket and pressed it against her chest the way someone might hold a prayer, wondering what her father would say to her now. The man who had taught her that language was a sword, but had never taught her what to do when the blade turned and cut into her own flesh. She drew a trembling breath, pushed herself away from the street lamp, and continued toward the train station, each step heavy with the knowledge that no matter how the night ended, when the sun rose tomorrow, she would still have to find a way out of the wreckage she had just created, and she had no idea where that way would come from. Morning came to Della through a haze somewhere between waking and sleep, because she had barely closed her eyes all night, lying in the darkness and listening to the steady rhythm of Toby's breathing while she waited for dawn with a vague fear that it would bring something terrible with it. She rose early, warmed a glass of milk for him, and prepared the little boy for school with a calmness she forced onto her face, using every last bit of strength she had left, and only after Toby had disappeared through the classroom door under Mrs. Kowalski's watchful care did she allow her shoulders to sag. She had planned to begin searching for work that very morning, to knock on the door of any place still hiring, to do anything that might bring in enough money before the end of the week, but the moment she stepped out of the building, that fragile plan vanished. A gleaming black car was parked directly in front of her crumbling apartment house, long, low, and motionless like a predator waiting to strike, the kind of car she had never once seen on this street in all her life, so out of place that several passers-by turned their heads to stare. Della stopped on the front steps, and in that instant she knew, with the kind of instinct that sent cold crawling down her spine, that the car had come for her. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and slender in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his hair neatly combed, his face composed and utterly without emotion, the kind of composure that unsettled a person far more than open aggression ever could. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, every movement slow and precise, and when he spoke, his voice was so politely gentle that it almost sounded kind, the kind of gentleness carefully honed to conceal something sharp beneath it. "Miss Rourke," he said, not as a question, but as confirmation, as though he had known exactly who she was long before she appeared. "My name is Silvio Bianchi. Someone wishes to meet with you. The car is waiting." Della felt her heart hammering high in her throat, but she kept her face still and refused to let her voice tremble. "I don't know anyone who travels in a car like this," she replied, "and I don't make a habit of getting into vehicles with strangers." Silvio smiled, a fleeting expression that never reached his eyes. "I understand your caution, and I respect it," he said, "but I'm afraid this isn't exactly an invitation you're free to decline. The man who wishes to see you isn't accustomed to waiting, and believe me, Miss Rourke, it would be wise for you to hear what he has to say, for your own sake, and for the sake of those you care about." He delivered the final words softly, almost warmly, but they dropped into Della's heart like a block of ice, because she immediately understood the meaning hidden beneath them, the deliberate way he referred to those she cared about without needing to say who they were. It was a threat wrapped in beautiful layers of courtesy, and she knew that the very thing she had feared throughout the night had finally found her. She thought about running, but where could she go, and what would she leave behind? She thought about screaming for help, but who on this street would dare stand against a car like that? She thought about Toby sitting in his classroom only a few blocks away, and she understood that she didn't truly have a choice, that the world she had accidentally provoked the night before had now come all the way to her front door, and the only way to protect what she loved was to enter that world with her head held high, rather than allow herself to be dragged into it by fear. She drew a deep breath, pulled the collar of her coat higher, and descended the steps. "If I go," she said, her voice so steady that it surprised even her, "then I'll get into the car on my own. No one needs to pull me inside, and I need to be home before my brother gets out of school." Silvio inclined his head, a gesture that seemed partly approving and partly assessing, then opened the car door wider for her. "You're an interesting woman, Miss Rourke," he said quietly. "I'm beginning to understand why he wants to meet you so badly." Della stepped into the shadowed interior of the car, where the scent of expensive leather and a heavy silence closed around her, and when the door shut with a soft but final click, she knew that the door leading back to her old life had also closed behind her, and that she was being carried towards something she couldn't yet begin to imagine. The car moved through streets that grew more elegant with every passing block, leaving the rows of gray buildings behind as it entered a district Della had only ever seen in films, where mansions stood concealed behind tall iron gates and severely trimmed trees, until at last it stopped before a vast entrance that opened automatically as the vehicle approached, as though the entire estate had been expecting her. The Castellanos mansion rose at the end of a gravel drive, an imposing structure of gray stone, majestic and cold, beautiful in a way that made a person feel small, rather than welcome. Silvio led her through immense marble hallways where every footstep echoed and ancient portraits watched her from the walls with the eyes of people who had been dead for generations, and as they walked, Della began to notice something she hadn't recognized at first: the silence. This was a house filled with people. She could sense them in the figures glimpsed at the far ends of corridors, in the men dressed in dark clothing standing guard at the corners, in the servants moving past without a sound. Yet all of them carried a certain tension, a hidden wariness, as though everyone were listening for something no one dared speak aloud. When they passed a room where several men were talking quietly, Silvio offered only a brief greeting and mentioned a name Della didn't recognize, saying that the man would no longer be attending lunch that day, and she saw the entire group fall silent at once, their eyes darting toward one another as a sudden stiffness crossed their faces, before they quickly nodded and dispersed. No one asked why. No one said another word. The name had been released into the room, and the room had closed around it like water sealing itself over a sinking stone. And although Della didn't understand what had happened, she could still feel the weight of that moment pressing against her skin. She understood, with the instincts of someone who had grown up among dangerous places, that in this house no one needed to raise his voice to decide another person's fate, that a name spoken softly between two casual greetings could carry the meaning of a sentence, and that the man who ruled this place held a kind of power that was neither displayed nor questioned, a power so absolute that a single nod was enough. The thought made her shiver, but at the same time, something else began to reveal itself in her mind. She realized that the atmosphere of suspicion surrounding this place wasn't directed only outward, but inward as well. That the people here weren't merely wary of the world beyond these walls, but of one another, and every glance carried a silent question about who stood with whom, who could be trusted, and who couldn't. This was a house where loyalty was purchased through fear and could be sold at any moment, a place where the man in power was surrounded by countless people willing to bow their heads, yet not a single person he could truly turn his back on without fearing a knife between his shoulders. And in that moment, before she had even met the man who had summoned her, Della began to understand something dimly, that perhaps in the middle of an empire crowded with soldiers and advisors, he was searching for something so rare that none of the wealth in this house could buy it. Someone who didn't belong to his world, someone who didn't fear him enough to lie and didn't need him enough to flatter. Silvio stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of the hallway, placed his hand on the brass handle, then turned to look at her with an unreadable expression. "He's waiting for you inside," he said quietly. "A sincere word of advice, Miss Rourke. Tell him the truth. He can forgive many things, but lying isn't one of them." Then he pushed the door open. The room beyond was an immense library paneled in dark wood, with towering bookshelves stretching from floor to ceiling, and at the far end, seated behind a massive wooden desk, the man from the previous night's party was waiting for her. The phone screen was gone, and so was the weariness that had covered his face like a layer of dust. Now, when he looked up at her, those dark eyes were so cold and alert that Della felt stripped bare by a single glance. Rafael Castellanos rose, tall and composed, and motioned for her to take the chair across from him. And once she was seated, he wasted no time on greetings but immediately placed a thick stack of papers on the desk between them, photocopied letters filled with dense lines of writing that made Della's heart tighten with curiosity from the very first glance. "You can read this, can't you, Miss Rourke?" he said in a low, quiet voice, not as a request, but almost as a challenge. Della lowered her gaze to the pages, and what she saw made her forget both her fear and her caution for a moment. It appeared to be a meaningless tangle, Russian script woven together with the dockside slang of Naples she had once heard in hoarse voices along the wharves of her childhood, mixed with abbreviations used in maritime shipping, all of it braided into a private language that an ordinary person would dismiss as nonsense. But Della wasn't ordinary, and as her eyes moved across the lines, one part of her mind had already begun working automatically, untangling the confusion, separating the layers of language, and identifying patterns. "These are exchanges of correspondence," she said softly, almost to herself. The writer deliberately blended several languages and forms of slang so that no one could decipher them without having lived in exactly those places. It isn't a mechanical cipher. It's a human cipher, built from lived experience. She looked up and found Rafe watching her intently, and there was something in his gaze that had just been confirmed. He sat down, leaned back in his chair, and began to speak in an even voice, though every word carried immense weight. He told her the letters had been intercepted from a network trying to strangle his operations at the harbor, a patient and ruthless rival force working its way into every opening, and worse, that there were signs they had succeeded because a traitor was hiding within his own ranks. "I have an entire organization working for me," he said, and for the first time Della heard genuine exhaustion in his voice. "There are men I fed and educated, men who swore they would die for me, but I can't place these papers in the hands of any of them, because I no longer know which tongue in this house is speaking the enemy's language. I went to outside experts, but they managed only a few scattered lines before admitting defeat. They said this required someone who hadn't merely studied these languages, but had lived inside them." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then last night, at my own dinner table, a waitress suddenly brought my fiancé to her knees, using the exact 3 languages I needed." Della felt her blood turn cold. "You investigated me," she said, "and it wasn't a question." "All night," Rafe admitted without hesitation. "I know your name is Della Rourke, and that you're 27 years old. I know your father was a professor of linguistics, a man who took you across Europe and died with your mother in a fire many years ago. I know you're raising a sick younger brother, working 3 jobs to survive, and that you owe nothing to anyone in my world." He paused. "Your record is clean. You have no connection to my enemies, and that is precisely what I need." Della sat in silence, feeling completely exposed, yet also realizing that everything he had uncovered was only the outer shell of her life, the part anyone could find if they searched hard enough, while the deeper layers remained hidden in darkness, even from a man as powerful as he was. "So you summoned me," she said slowly, "to translate the letters you don't trust anyone else enough to handle." Rafe nodded. "I need an outsider. More than that, I need someone who hates me." He caught the flash of surprise on her face, and one corner of his mouth lifted without becoming a smile. "A person who admires me will conceal parts of the truth to please me. A person who fears me will say what I want to hear. But someone like you, someone who looks at me and this entire world with contempt she doesn't bother to hide, will tell me exactly what is written on the page, no matter how ugly it may be. That is something I can't buy from anyone loyal to me." He placed one hand on the stack of papers. "You'll work here, inside this mansion. These letters aren't to leave this room, and you won't copy or carry anything outside. In return, I'll pay you enough to make every financial problem in your life disappear." Della looked at him, her heart pounding, and understood that the door she had just walked through would never allow her to return to the person she had once been. Enough to make every financial problem in her life disappear. The words hung in the air between them like forbidden fruit, and every part of Della wanted to lunge forward and seize it, because it was exactly what she had begged fate for through so many sleepless nights. The only doorway out from beneath the deadline hanging over the end of the week. Toby's breath, his future. Yet precisely because she wanted it so desperately, because it touched the weakest place inside her, something stubborn rose in response. A warning voice telling her that if she entered this agreement like a starving person snatching up a piece of bread thrown at her feet, then she would forever remain beneath this man in his eyes. treated as something purchased, rather than as a human being. She had spent her entire life being invisible, being the shadow people ordered around and then forgot, and something deep within her said that if this truly was the moment her life changed direction, she wouldn't enter it on her knees. So instead of nodding, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and looked directly into Rafe's dark eyes. "You need me," she said, her voice calm to the point of coldness. "More than I need your money." She saw one of his eyebrows rise slightly, and she continued before he could interrupt. "You just admitted that your entire empire doesn't have a single person capable of reading those pages. You tried experts, and they failed. You can't trust anyone inside your own house. That means that right now, in this entire city, I may be the only person who can open the lock that is choking your business. So let's speak as equals, not as an employer and a hired servant." The room fell silent. Della could hear her own heart beating, and she half expected an explosion of anger, half expected Silvio to walk in and drag her away. But Rafe didn't become angry. He only studied her for a long moment, his gaze slow and searching. And then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth curved into something close to amusement. "Do you know," he said quietly, "that the last person who dared speak to me in that tone no longer sits at my dinner table?" It was a threat, and they both knew it, but Della didn't blink. "Then perhaps you've grown too accustomed to being surrounded by people who are too frightened to tell you the truth," she replied. "And from what you just told me, that is exactly why you're in trouble, isn't it?" A long silence followed, and then Rafe let out a low, brief laugh, the sound of a man who hadn't been genuinely surprised by anything in a very long time. "Very well," he said, leaning back. "You want to be treated as an equal. Then tell me your terms." Della drew a breath and began, stating each condition as though she had spent her whole life preparing for this moment. She would work in this room, exactly as he required, and she agreed to that. But she would be treated as a professional, not a servant. No one would stand behind her watching as though she were a thief. She would keep her own hours so she could return home to her brother each day and wouldn't be held there like a prisoner. And as for the payment, she wouldn't accept the entire sum either before or after the work. She wanted half paid immediately when she began, so she could take care of urgent matters that couldn't wait, and the other half when the work was finished, so he would know she intended to see it through rather than abandon it, and so she would know she hadn't been bought outright. Rafe listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he remained silent for a moment, as though weighing every word. "Half before, half after," he repeated. "You don't trust me to pay." "It wasn't a question. I don't trust anyone in your world," Della answered plainly. "Just as you don't trust anyone in your world. Perhaps that is the only thing we have in common." This time Rafe truly smiled, a fleeting but genuine smile, and for that brief moment his cold features softened, revealing a glimpse of something almost human. "Miss Rourke," he said, "you are the strangest person who has ever sat in that chair. I summoned someone to translate letters, and instead I found a woman willing to bargain with me inside my own home when she has nothing in her hands but pride." He rose and extended his hand across the desk. "Very well. I accept every one of your conditions. Half before, half after, your own hours, and the respect you demand." Della looked at the hand offered to her, a large hand with calloused knuckles that didn't resemble the hand of an idle gentleman, then placed her own small, work-worn hand into it and held firmly, and in that handshake she felt a strange current pass through her, a sense that she had just signed herself into something far greater than a simple working agreement, though she couldn't yet give it a name. The work began the very next morning, and Della quickly became immersed in it, in the way only those who truly love language can understand, that state in which time and space disappear, while the mind devotes itself to loosening every knot in a labyrinth someone else has constructed. She sat at the small table beside the library window, where daylight spilled across the pages, and little by little, she peeled away the tangled outer layers of the letters, separating the Russian from the Neapolitan dockside slang, identifying the disguised words they used to conceal their true meaning, things an outsider might read as references to grain or silk trading, but which were actually dirty payments, and the names of people who had been bought. Rafe was often in the room, seated at his own desk not far away, pretending to examine stacks of ledgers but occasionally looking up to watch her work with an attention she could feel even without meeting his gaze. And gradually the initial tension between them began to dissolve into a more comfortable silence, the silence of two people focused on the same purpose. But one afternoon, as Della worked her way through a particularly intricate passage near the end of the stack, she suddenly froze. the pencil in her hand, stopping abruptly above the page as though someone had turned it to ice. There was a name. It wasn't written plainly but concealed inside a sequence of symbols. Yet when she deciphered it, when the letters slowly took shape beneath the point of her pencil, she felt as though the ground had collapsed beneath her feet. It was her father's name. It lay there among the words of a criminal network, mentioned as a man who had translated documents for them many years earlier, spoken of in the tone people used when recalling a former associate. Della sat motionless, her heart pounding inside her chest. And for a moment she told herself that she had read it incorrectly, that it was merely a cruel coincidence of names, because her father had been a scholar, a gentle man who believed that language could help people understand one another, not someone who hired out his talents to smuggling organizations. But then her eyes dropped to the following line, where a strange sequence of symbols appeared, something she had initially mistaken for just another part of the code, and a chill traveled down her spine as she realized that she had seen those exact symbols before. She had seen them thousands of times. They filled the final pages of her father's dictionary. Those mysterious lines she had spent her entire childhood believing were part of a secret game he had invented to entertain the two children, the same game Toby had mentioned only the night before, the game she had promised that one day she would solve for him. Della's hand trembled as she pulled the dictionary from her pocket, hurriedly turned to the final pages, placed them beside the letter, and compared them. They matched. The same system of symbols, the same way of mixing Russian letters with short markings, the same hand, the same mind, had created them both. Her father hadn't merely understood this private language. He had been one of the people who used it. The entire room seemed to spin around her, and the memories she had buried for so long suddenly rose to the surface, arranging themselves into a new and terrifying shape. Her father's unusual restlessness during his final days, the way he had clutched the leather briefcase filled with papers, the way he had stood beside the window and stared down at the street as though he were waiting for something. The endless journeys across Europe that she had assumed as a child were simply part of a professor's teaching career. Could there have been another man hidden behind the image of the scholarly father she had worshipped all her life? A man she had never truly known? Could her entire childhood, and the beautiful faith she had carried like a flame through so many years of darkness, have been built upon a lie? Nausea rose inside Della, along with a slow, seeping sense of betrayal that seemed to come directly from the pages in her hands. And in that moment she nearly called out to Rafe, nearly told him everything she had just discovered, because that was what an honest translator was supposed to do. But she stopped herself. She pressed her lips tightly together and forced her breathing to become steady, because amid the panic, the coldest and most rational part of her, the part forged through years of surviving by the precision of words, issued a warning. She hadn't finished deciphering the passage. She had uncovered only the name and the surface connection, but she didn't yet know the context, didn't know what her father had done with these people, whether he had acted willingly or under coercion, whether he had been an accomplice or a pawn, or perhaps something entirely different that she hadn't yet imagined. Reaching a hurried conclusion now, whether to protect herself or to be honest with Rafe, would be the gravest mistake someone in her profession could make, because a translation that misunderstood a single shade of meaning could turn a victim into a criminal. She wouldn't allow fear and love to lead her into passing a false judgment on her dead father. She needed to keep reading. She needed to decipher every remaining line, needed to uncover the entire truth before she said anything at all, even if that truth shattered her heart. So Della quietly closed the dictionary, returned it to her pocket, drew a deep breath to conceal the turmoil raging inside her, then lowered her head over the page and continued working, carrying a new and crushing secret that she knew she would have to bear alone until she understood what it truly meant. A few nights later, when the work had stretched far into the night and the entire mansion had fallen into silence, Della was still seated over the pages beneath the soft glow of the desk lamp, and instead of summoning Silvio to take her home, as he usually did, Rafe poured her a cup of hot tea with his own hands and sat down in the chair across from her, saying nothing, simply allowing the silence between them to linger in the strange warmth of the book-filled room. Beyond the windows, the city shimmered with distant points of light, and there was something about that late hour, about the bone-deep exhaustion that had followed so many days of intense concentration, that made the walls both of them had built around themselves seem thinner than before. Rafe was the first to break the silence. He asked about the scar on her arm, the one she always kept hidden beneath her sleeve but had exposed under the lamplight that night, while absorbed in her writing. Della stiffened for a moment, her first instinct to evade the question as she always had. But then she looked into his dark eyes and saw not intrusive curiosity, but something quieter, almost the understanding of a man who carried scars of his own. So she spoke. She didn't retell the events of that night. She didn't need to, and she couldn't. Those images remained locked in the deepest place inside her. She spoke only of what had remained after everything else, the feeling that had followed her through all those years like a shadow that never left. "I was there," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her tea, close enough to do something, and I wasn't fast enough. People told me no one was to blame, that it couldn't have been prevented, but those words never reached the place that hurt. Because every morning when I wake, the first thing I feel isn't grief. It is the question of why it was me, why I was the one who survived when they didn't. I carry my brother through each day. I do everything I can for him, but even when he smiles at me, even in the happiest moments, there is still a voice inside me whispering that I don't deserve that joy, that I purchased it with the lives of the people I couldn't save. She looked up, and there were no tears in her eyes, only a naked honesty so raw that Rafe seemed to stop breathing for a moment. "I'm not telling you this so you'll pity me," she said. "I'm telling you because perhaps this is the first time in my life I have sat before someone I believed wouldn't look at me as though I were something pitiful." Rafe remained silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, lower now, as though he were drawing the words from a place as deep and painful as the one she had just opened. "I understand the burden of surviving better than you think," he said. Then he told her, without looking at her, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, about a childhood that bore no resemblance to hers, filled with books and journeys. He spoke of a father, a man who ruled his family through fear, who considered tenderness a weakness and taught his children more often with a heavy hand than with words, a man who had pushed him into this dark world when he was still too young to understand where he was being led. He spoke of his older brother, the only person who had ever protected him inside that cold house, the man he had watched being taken from him during a bloody purge between rival powers, and how that moment, the moment he had stood helplessly and watched the person he loved most die, had killed part of him forever. "I inherited all of this," he said, gesturing toward the magnificent room and the invisible empire stretching beyond it, "but I didn't inherit it because I wanted it. I inherited it because I was the one left alive. And do you know the most bitterly amusing part, Miss Rourke? I possess everything people mistake for power. Dozens of men ready to do whatever I command. Yet I don't have a single person I can turn my back on without fearing a knife. There are secrets in my work known only to the few people closest to me, people I have trusted for years, and yet it is from that very small circle that my enemies have learned things no one outside it should ever have known." He stopped, and in the dim light, Della saw on his cold face a loneliness so profound that her heart tightened. "Then perhaps we are both survivors," she said softly, "carrying the dead with us and wondering why we are still here." Rafe looked at her, and in that moment, between two people divided by an entire chasm of different worlds, an invisible thread formed, fragile yet enduring, the bond of two hearts that understood what it meant to carry scars and still be forced to keep walking. Neither of them said another word, but both knew that something had changed, and that they would never look at one another as they had in the beginning again. The call came late the following afternoon, while Della was still at the mansion, bent over the pages, and Mrs. Kowalski's trembling voice on the other end told her that Toby seemed more tired than usual that day, that the boy needed to be taken to a doctor, and those few words were enough to make Della's entire world contract into a single point. She sprang to her feet, the page slipping from her hand, and all the composure she had worked so hard to maintain before this man vanished in an instant, revealing a terrified sister whose little brother was everything she had left in the world. She stammered an apology, said that she had to leave immediately, that she would return and make up the hours, her hand already reaching for her coat, and she didn't notice that Rafe had risen with her, that he was watching her with an unfamiliar expression on his face. "Your brother," he said, and it wasn't a question. Della could only nod, her throat too tight for words, and what happened next left her stunned. Rafe didn't call Silvio or issue an order to anyone. He picked up the keys himself, put on his coat, and told her to follow him to the car, his voice allowing no argument, yet carrying none of the force of a command, only the calm certainty of a man who intended to help bear the weight. On the way to the hospital, while Della sat beside him, with her hands clasped tightly together, he took out his phone and called someone, speaking briefly and decisively. And when they arrived, a doctor was already waiting for them at the entrance. a specialist Della knew someone like her might have waited months to see. Now standing there after a single phone call, Toby was taken inside and treated with the greatest care, surrounded by the gentle hands of nurses and soft words of reassurance, while Della was told to wait in the hallway as they examined him. She lowered herself onto the hard chair beneath the hospital's white lights, and this time she no longer tried to appear strong. She buried her face in her hands, her entire body trembling with the fear she had held back throughout the drive. Then she felt someone sit down beside her. Rafe, the man who ruled half the city's darkness, the man whose single nod could make another person disappear, was now sitting on a rigid plastic chair in a hospital corridor, saying nothing, urging nothing, not glancing at his phone, simply remaining there, a silent and steady presence beside her in the moment of her greatest weakness. Della lifted her head and looked at him, and she realized that this was something he himself probably wasn't accustomed to doing, simply sitting beside another person when he couldn't command the situation to improve, couldn't use power or money to force fear to disappear, and could only wait like any other ordinary human being. "You don't have to stay," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "I know," he replied, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. "But I'm staying." And he did stay, through all those endless hours while the hands of the clock crept forward and the hospital corridor gradually emptied. He didn't say much, but from time to time he brought her a cup of hot coffee from the machine at the far end of the hallway. And now and then, he said something calm to pull her back from the spiral of dark thoughts. And whenever she looked up, he was still there, as steady as stone in the middle of a storm. At one point, during the deepest hours of the night, Della drifted off from exhaustion, and when she startled awake, she found Rafe's coat draped over her shoulders while he sat upright beside her, keeping watch as she slept. Then at last, when the sky beyond the windows began to turn the silvery gray of dawn, the doctor emerged with a reassuring smile and told them that Toby was stable, that the boy only needed rest and further observation, that the worst had passed and he would soon recover. Della broke into tears, unable to hide them this time, tears of relief streaming down her face, and she was taken in to see him. Toby lay there, small against the white hospital bed, the color already returning to his face, and when he saw his sister, he gave her that trusting smile that seemed to believe in the whole world. Then his eyes shifted toward the tall man, standing quietly by the door. "Are you my sister's friend?" Toby asked in a sleepy but cheerful voice. And Rafe, a man who had never known how to answer such a question, hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, and with a tenderness he perhaps hadn't known he still possessed, he said that yes, he was her friend, and that he was very glad Toby was feeling better. Toby smiled brightly and held out his tiny hand, and when Rafe bent down and enclosed it within his large, calloused one, Della saw something break open in his face, the first fracture in the cold fortress he had built around his heart through all those years, and through that fracture, for the first time, she saw the true man hidden inside. In the days as Toby gradually recovered, Della returned to the library with a new determination, because the secret she had carried since discovering her father's name was still there, unresolved and unexplained, and she knew she wouldn't have another peaceful night until she followed the truth all the way to its end. She threw herself into that passage with every skill she possessed, patiently stripping away each layer of disguise, comparing it against the symbols in her father's dictionary, and little by little, like a picture slowly emerging from beneath the dust of time, the real story began to reveal itself, and when it finally appeared in full, Della had to grip the edge of the table to keep her knees from giving way, because what she found wasn't proof of her father's guilt, but something far more devastating to her heart. Those people had once approached her father, exactly as the earlier passage had suggested. They needed someone who could translate and encode their filthy documents, someone fluent in the precise languages they used to conceal their crimes. And with his gifts, her father had been the perfect candidate, but he had refused. The gentle man who believed language existed so people could understand one another, not deceive and destroy one another, had said no. He had turned his back on them even though he understood the price of defying men like that. And the letter, written by those very people with the coldness of men recording an unpaid debt, recalled what had happened as a warning to anyone else who might dare disobey them, saying that the stubborn scholar from years before had been dealt with, that the fire which consumed his home hadn't been an accident of fate, but their own hand coming down upon him. Della sat motionless for a long time, the words blurring before her eyes, and the entire understanding of the world she had lived with for so many years collapsed and rebuilt itself within that single moment. The fire hadn't been a tragic accident she was supposed to learn to accept. Her parents hadn't died because of an old electrical wire. They had been murdered, deliberately murdered by the same network, now tightening its grip around Rafe, the same people to whom these letters belonged, the same enemy whose every line she was sitting there deciphering. The guilt that had weighed on her for all those years, the tormenting belief that she should have been able to do something, suddenly transformed into something entirely different, something hot, sharp, and directed. A pure fury she had never known she was capable of feeling. For years she had blamed herself for failing to save them, had lived beneath the shadow of a question without an answer. And now she finally understood that she had never been guilty at all, that no effort of hers could have stopped a crime already decided by people far more ruthless than she had ever imagined. Her father hadn't been an accomplice. He had been a man who chose death rather than betray what he believed. And the secret game he had left behind inside the dictionary, the private language he had taught her as though it were only a game, may have been the final gift he gave his daughter, the key that would one day allow her to understand everything. Tears streamed down Della's cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of bitter release mingled with determination. She rose, gathered the pages in her hands, and went to find Rafe. When she told him, her voice trembled but never faltered, telling him about her father, about his refusal, about the fire, about the network that had taken her family from her and was now threatening him. She saw Rafe's face change in a way she had never witnessed before. He stood in silence, and in his eyes there wasn't only shock, but something almost like shame. The shame of a man who had just discovered the limits of his own power. "I had you investigated down to the smallest detail," he said quietly, almost to himself. "My people searched every record, every document, every hidden corner of your past, and all they found was a fire, an accident, an unfortunate professor of linguistics. Not one trace, not one thread leading to this truth." He looked up at her, and there was a chilling seriousness in his gaze. "Do you understand what that means, Della? If they could bury a crime so completely that even my resources couldn't uncover it after all these years, then they are more dangerous and more sophisticated than I ever believed. I underestimated them." Della looked at him, and when she spoke, her voice had changed, carrying a new weight. "Then from this moment on, this is no longer only my job," she said. "You hired me to save your business, but these people took my parents from me. They made me live in guilt for years over a crime I never committed. So I will decipher every one of these letters to the final line, not for your money anymore, but because I need to know every name, every face belonging to the people who burned my life to the ground." And Rafe, looking into the gray eyes now burning with the fire of resolve, understood that the woman before him had ceased to be an employee and had become an ally bound to this war by her own flesh and blood. With the new fire of determination burning inside her, Della threw herself into the remaining letters like a woman possessed. And only 2 days later, when she reached the newest correspondence, the letters written most recently, she discovered something that turned her blood to ice. This was no longer about business rivalries or bribing officials. The latest lines described a plan, a specific and ruthless plan, to destroy one of Rafe's largest warehouses at the harbor, not to rob it, but to burn it to the ground, to strike a blow powerful enough to make his entire empire stagger. And what tightened Della's heart wasn't the loss of property, but one detail hidden among those cold lines, that the plan would be carried out at night, during an active shift, while workers were still inside laboring to provide for their families. Innocent people, fathers and mothers who had nothing to do with the war between powerful men, would be reduced to collateral damage in an act of revenge. Della brought the discovery to Rafe immediately, and she watched his face darken, not with the calculating concern of a man weighing profit against loss, but with the deep anger of someone who couldn't bear the thought of human lives being treated with such contempt. It was in the middle of that moment, while the two of them were bent over the pages deciding how to stop the attack, that Silvio entered and announced that someone had arrived asking to see him. Mr. Gareth Mullen, the family's longtime financial advisor, who had just returned from a trip and claimed to be carrying a solution to the trouble at the harbor. Mullen entered the library with the ease of a man who knew the room intimately. A middle-aged gentleman in an expensive suit, wearing a composed smile and speaking in a voice as smooth as oil, and he began describing a negotiation that could settle everything, reasonable fees that would have to be paid to purchase peace. Della, seated quietly in the corner, paid little attention at first, until her gaze happened to fall upon his right hand resting on the desk, and she saw it, the hand missing its smallest finger, with only an empty space where the finger should have been. A chill ran down her spine. In the letters she had just deciphered, among the disguised names, one figure had been mentioned again and again by a title: the gatekeeper, the man missing a finger, the one who ate bread from both tables, a description she had originally assumed was nothing more than an obscure metaphor. Now, as she looked at the incomplete hand of the man sitting comfortably before them and speaking of solutions and peace, every piece suddenly fell into place. The informant wasn't some nameless subordinate. He was sitting right there, inside that very room, a man who had been trusted for years. Della rose, and before reason could stop her, she spoke a sharp sentence in Neapolitan dockside slang, the exact language used only by the people who paid him, a phrase referring to the gatekeeper and the man who dined at 2 tables. The effect was immediate and impossible to deny. Gareth Mullen froze in the middle of a sentence, his smooth smile hardening on his lips, and all the blood seemed to drain from his face, revealing beneath the mask of composure the naked terror of a man who had just been exposed. He understood the sentence. He understood it far too well, and that understanding condemned him more powerfully than any evidence could have done. Rafe surged to his feet, and in that instant the composed man vanished, replaced by a cold and dangerous force Della had previously known only through whispered stories. Before Mullen could reach the door, Rafe blocked his path, and with several swift, decisive movements, he subdued the traitor and pinned him against the wall, his voice dropping into a sound that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. He didn't beat him, and he had no need for theatrical violence. The weight of restrained fury in his voice alone was enough to make Mullen tremble. He demanded, one word at a time, to know who the informant had betrayed him to, what he had sold, and for how long. Trapped with nowhere left to turn, Mullen finally began to confess in a broken voice, admitting that he had taken money from the rival network, passed them internal information, and deliberately looked away while they worked their way into the harbor. But even with his back against the wall, a trace of cunning still appeared in his eyes, and he gave a dry, twisted laugh. "You think catching me ends this, Castellanos," he rasped. "I'm only the messenger. Do you truly believe I could have known everything? I sold them on my own. Some of the information I passed outside should have been known only by the people closest to you. Ask yourself who has always stood nearest to you, so near that you never once thought to suspect them." The words were released and remained hanging in the air like poison, and Della saw Rafe go still, saw the shadow of suspicion pass across his face, and in that moment the entire room seemed to sink beneath the weight of a question that had no answer. The shadow of suspicion had barely fallen across Rafe's face when Della stepped forward, and it was she who pulled him back from the psychological trap Mullen had set in the final breath of his betrayal. "Don't let him do this," she said quickly and firmly, her eyes still fixed on the pages in her hands. "He is planting suspicion, so you will tear your own ranks apart from within. It is the final move of a man who has already lost. I have read every one of these letters, every single line, and I know exactly how the information was leaked." She turned to the passage she had marked and showed it to him, speaking with the voice of a professional who wouldn't allow emotion to distort the truth. The clues in the letters didn't point to someone in Rafe's innermost circle, as Mullen had implied, but to a low-level channel of communication, an insignificant courier whose only task was to carry scattered fragments of information, a man Mullen had used as a screen so he could cast suspicion upon innocent people. The name Mullen had deliberately left unspoken. The insinuation aimed at the man who always stood closest to Rafe was his final cruel strike against Silvio, the right hand who had remained loyal to him for so many years. And if Rafe took the bait, the powerful leader would remove the most trustworthy man he had with his own hands, exactly as the enemy intended. Rafe looked at the pages Della was showing him, then turned toward Silvio, who stood silently beside the door with his face hardened by the injustice of the accusation. And in one brief moment, while the entire room seemed to hold its breath, he made his choice. He trusted Della's evidence over the poison of a traitor's words. But there was no time for relief, because the final letters concealed another detail that demanded immediate action. The plan to destroy the warehouse had been moved forward, and that fateful night wasn't some distant point in the future. It was tonight. The room erupted into a storm of urgent movement, instead of unleashing his fury upon Mullen in the way men from his world usually dealt with betrayal. Rafe made a decision that stunned Della. He ordered the man restrained and handed over to the authorities so that he would answer before the law rather than disappear without a trace. "Killing him would be too easy," he said, with cold contempt. "Let him live and face what he has done." Then he turned to the orders that truly mattered, and the first command he gave, before protecting his property or pursuing his enemies, was to evacuate every worker from the warehouse district immediately. Della watched him issue that order and understood that he was doing it because of her, because of everything she had said about innocent lives, because the crack in the cold fortress around his heart had now opened wide enough to let the light of compassion through. They raced toward the harbor through the darkness, and there, among the towering rows of shipping containers and the dim yellow lights, a desperate race against time began. Della didn't remain on the sidelines. She stood beside Rafe, because the letters mentioned signals and coded phrases the saboteurs used to communicate and mark the moment of action, and she was the only person who could understand them. While Rafe's men spread throughout the harbor, moving from one section to another and ushering workers outside, Della listened and watched with intense concentration, translating fragments of intercepted signals over the radios, following them to determine the precise location and timing of the attack, helping Rafe's people understand where to concentrate their efforts and how much time remained. She directed them toward the most dangerous section, the warehouse where the night shift was still working, and during those breathless minutes, group after group of workers was brought safely outside, confused people who had no idea what was happening but were still alive, still able to return home to their families. There were moments when everything seemed about to slip beyond their control, when time was running out and people were still trapped inside. But because of what Della had deciphered, Rafe's men reached the right place at the right moment and pulled the final workers out of danger just before the saboteurs were meant to strike. When the plot was stopped, when the perpetrators were captured before they could unleash disaster, a strange silence settled over the harbor, the silence of catastrophe narrowly avoided. No one had been harmed. No father failed to return home that night, and no child lost a parent as Della had so many years before. She stood in the middle of the harbor, breathing hard, her hair disheveled and her hands trembling from the strain, watching the workers being led to safety, and she felt something inside her chest begin to soften, as though by saving these strangers, she had also begun to heal some part of herself, the part that had shattered on a winter night long ago. Rafe came to stand beside her, and amid the chaos, the two of them simply looked at one another without speaking, because everything was already contained within their eyes, understanding, gratitude, and something else neither of them yet dared to name. A few days after the night at the harbor, when everything had settled, and Della had returned to the rhythm of ordinary life with a lightness she hadn't felt in a very long time, she decided to do what the deadline hanging over the end of the week had been urging her toward all along: go to the hospital and secure Toby's place for treatment, even though her heart was still heavy because she knew she hadn't managed to gather the full deposit they required. She had planned to use part of the money Rafe had advanced her, to beg the hospital to let her pay the remainder in installments, to do anything necessary to keep that place for her brother. But when she sat down across from the woman at the billing desk and gave her name, the woman typed several keys on the computer, frowned briefly, then looked up at Della with a puzzled expression and told her that according to the records, her deposit had already been paid in full, and not only the deposit, but all of Toby's upcoming treatment expenses had been taken care of as well. Della sat there in stunned silence, certain there had been some mistake, and she asked again and again, but the employee only smiled and assured her that there was no mistake at all. Everything had been paid, and her little boy would receive the care he needed without her having to worry about money any longer. While her mind was still spinning as she tried to understand what had happened, she began asking about the old debt she had carried on her back for so many years, the debt connected to a lending company that regularly sent someone to remind her of what she owed, and the answer she received left her even more shaken. That debt was gone too. It had been completely erased, and not a single dollar remained hanging over her head. Della left the hospital in a daze, and on the way home she followed every thread she could find in her mind, trying to discover who had done this, until a truth slowly began to emerge that made her heart tighten. She started asking questions and tracing the lending company that had loaned money to her father years ago and later turned its collectors upon her, and she discovered that it wasn't an independent business at all, but one small link buried deep inside the underground financial network controlled by the Castellanos family. For all those years, the debt that had crushed her shoulders, stolen her sleep, and forced her to work 3 jobs at once had always been within the reach of the man she had known only a short time, and he had erased it. He had quietly eliminated both the debt and the cost of Toby's treatment without saying a word, without ever mentioning it, without asking for thanks or gratitude, without turning it into leverage to bind her to him, or a favor she would be forced to repay. He had simply done it and remained silent, as though it had never happened. Della stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, and tears suddenly spilled from her eyes beyond her control. Tears she didn't even know how to name, because what filled her heart was a confusion of emotions too great to bear. There was gratitude, a gratitude so deep it was almost painful, because that man had lifted from her shoulders a burden she had believed she would carry for the rest of her life. But there was also confusion, a bewilderment over how she was supposed to feel about someone capable of being so cold and yet so gentle. A man who lived in a world of darkness and power, but had used that very power not to suppress or control her, but to quietly protect her and her little brother. She had grown accustomed to believing that power in the hands of the strong always meant oppression, accustomed to watching wealthy and influential people use it to crush people like her, and she didn't know where Rafe belonged within that understanding of the world. The man who had used the very strength others feared to do the gentlest thing anyone had ever done for her. She thought of the way he had sat beside her all night at the hospital without saying a word, the way he had driven Toby there himself, the way he had ordered the workers saved before protecting his own property, and now this, the silent act she might never have discovered if chance hadn't revealed it. She realized that he didn't give her gifts to purchase her loyalty. He gave in silence because perhaps, for him, that was the only way he knew to express something too great for words to contain. And standing there among the indifferent stream of people passing by, holding her father's dictionary tightly against her chest, Della understood that her heart had traveled far beyond the boundaries she had allowed, that she had begun to care for this man in a way she had never dared admit, and that the truth of it was both sweeter and more frightening than any secret she had ever deciphered. Della returned to the mansion that afternoon with a heart full of unspoken things, words of gratitude she didn't know how to begin expressing, and perhaps something else she had only just dared whisper to herself. But the moment she entered the library, she sensed that something had changed. Rafe stood beside the window with his back to her, and when he turned, his face had returned to the cold, distant expression of the man she had met on the first day. The fortress she had believed she had watched collapse now rebuilt more securely than ever. A thick envelope lay neatly on the desk. "The work is finished," he said in an even voice stripped of all emotion. "You accomplished what no one else could. The letters have been deciphered, the traitor has been exposed, and the plot has been stopped. This is the remainder of the payment I promised, along with an additional reward for everything you did beyond our agreement. I thank you, Miss Rourke, but from this point forward, our paths will go in separate directions." Della stood frozen, feeling as though a bucket of icy water had been poured over her. "I don't understand," she said softly. "I thought..." She couldn't finish, because she didn't know exactly what she had thought, only that it hadn't been this. Rafe wouldn't look directly into her eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a hardness he had deliberately forced into place. "What did you think, Della? That a few sleepless nights and several stories from the past could erase the boundary between your world and mine? I have an engagement I am obligated to fulfill, an alliance between families upon which the very survival of this empire depends. You are an exceptional translator, and I am grateful to you for that. But don't mistake gratitude for something greater." Every word fell like the stroke of a knife, cold and precise, and Della felt a sharp pain pierce her chest, the pain of a heart that had only just dared to open and was now being forced shut again. She didn't beg or argue, because the pride that had followed her all her life wouldn't allow it. She only looked at him for one long moment, searching those dark eyes for some trace of the man who had sat beside her through the night at the hospital, the man who had quietly erased the burden she had carried for years. But he had hidden himself too well, and all she could see was a wall. What she couldn't see, what he had buried beneath that cruel coldness, was the truth that only hours earlier he had received terrible news, that although the rival network had been struck hard, its remaining members hadn't been entirely destroyed, and they had discovered her role. They knew that the woman who had translated the letters had become the Castellanos leader's new weakness, and they had placed a price on her life as an act of revenge. He was driving her away not because he didn't want her, but because he knew that as long as she remained beside him, as long as the world believed she was connected to him, both she and Toby would remain targets. The only way he could think of to keep her alive, to prevent that child from being orphaned all over again, was to push her as far away as possible, sever every bond, and convince the entire world that she meant nothing to him. He had chosen to let her hate him rather than allow her to die, and the price of that choice was that he had to stand there, look into the gray eyes he had already fallen in love with, and extinguish the light inside them with his own hands. But Della knew none of this. She only picked up the envelope from the desk, and it felt unbearably heavy in her hand. Not because of the money inside, but because of everything it represented, the ending of something she hadn't even had time to name. "Thank you," she said, her voice strangely calm, the calmness of someone who had learned to swallow pain while still far too young. "For everything. Even the things you believe I don't know." She saw him hesitate slightly at those words, but she didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked out of the library, out of that cold gray stone mansion, and returned home with a decision already forming inside her. She would use the money to begin again. She would take Toby away from this city, away from its shadows and memories, to some peaceful little town, where he could grow beneath the sunlight, instead of under the shadow of hidden empires. She would give him the childhood she herself had never known. And yet, as she sat in the attic apartment that night, packing their few belongings into 2 old suitcases, she couldn't shake the strange heaviness pressing against her chest. She had everything she had ever dreamed of: freedom, safety for her brother, a new beginning. She had won. Then why, she wondered as tears quietly fell onto the lid of the suitcase. Why did it feel so much like she was walking toward her own execution? The night she left, rain began to fall. A cold, late autumn downpour washing over the city as though the sky itself were weeping for everything that had never been spoken aloud. Della stood beneath the roof of the bus terminal with Toby, one hand holding tightly to his small fingers and the other gripping an old suitcase, waiting for the night bus that would carry the 2 of them away from the city forever. Toby looked up at his sister with clear, trusting eyes and asked whether the place they were going had many trees, whether there would be somewhere for him to run and play. And Della forced a smile onto her face and told him that yes, there would be so many trees, so much sunshine, a beautiful place just for him. But even as she spoke those words, her heart remained heavy with the strange feeling that she was leaving behind something that could never be replaced. Then, through the blurred curtain of rain, she heard tires screech against the wet pavement and saw a familiar car racing toward them before braking sharply in front of the station. The door flew open, and Rafe stepped out into the rain without an umbrella or a coat, allowing the water to pour over him until he was soaked through, and he ran toward her wearing an expression she had never seen before. The cold fortress completely shattered, revealing a man terrified that he had arrived too late. "Don't go," he said, his voice rough and broken, nothing like the cold, measured voice she had heard the last time they spoke. "Please, don't get on that bus." Della stood rooted to the ground, her heart beating wildly as she tried to hold on to the final remnants of her pride. "You made yourself very clear, Mr. Castellanos," she answered, her voice trembling. "Your world, my world. You have an engagement you are obligated to fulfill." Rafe shook his head as rain streamed down his face. "Not anymore," he said. "I ended it. I sat down with the other families, surrendered part of what I own, and accepted that my empire would become weaker in exchange for freedom from that alliance. And I did something else. The remaining members of the network threatened you, and I eliminated them completely, from the roots upward, so there is no one left who can reach you or Toby. You are safe now. Both of you are safe." Della felt the world spinning around her. "They threatened me," she whispered. "Is that why?" "That is why I pushed you away," Rafe interrupted. And now the truth poured out of him like water breaking through a dam. "They knew you were my weakness. They placed a price on your life, and I didn't know any other way to keep you alive except to make the entire world believe that you meant nothing to me. I stood there and said the cruelest things I could, watched myself hurt you, and every word cut into me. I would rather have you hate me and remain alive than love me and be placed in danger. But the danger has passed now, and I can't let you board that bus without telling you the truth." He stepped closer as the rain poured around them. "I have spent my entire life behind walls, Della. I believed the only way to survive was to make certain no one could ever reach me. Then you walked into my life, a waitress with nothing in her hands but pride, and you told me the truth when everyone else only knew how to bow. You made me angry, you confused me, and you brought down every wall I had spent a lifetime building. I don't need a beautiful wife who sits silently beside me as a decoration for my power. I need someone who dares tell me I am wrong when I am wrong. Someone who will scold me in all 3 languages when I am being foolish. I need you." Then he turned toward Toby, who was standing there staring at them with wide eyes, and his voice softened completely. "And I need you too, young man. I don't only want your sister. I want to give you a home. A place where you can grow up in peace, where you can run beneath the sunlight and never have to be afraid of anything. I promise I will protect you as I would protect myself." At that, The final wall inside Della broke apart, and her tears mingled with the rain as they streamed down her cheeks. She looked at the drenched man standing before her, the man who had surrendered part of his empire and even his own security simply to reach this moment. And she understood that this wasn't some beautiful declaration of love. It was something far more real, a truth laid bare with courage. "I have conditions," she said through her tears, and a trembling smile appeared on her lips. "You will have to learn how to pronounce my father's name correctly, and you will have to promise me that this child will never, not even for a single day, grow up in fear the way you did." Rafe let out a broken laugh filled with relief and happiness, then nodded. "I accept every one of your conditions," he said, repeating the exact words he had spoken on that very first day. Then he pulled her into his arms, and in the middle of the pouring rain, with Toby's small hand still clutching the edge of both their coats, they kissed. A kiss salted with tears and rain, the kiss of two survivors who had finally found their way home. That winter passed, and with it, a new chapter began to unfold in the lives of people who had once carried so many scars. Rafe kept his promise, and he began doing something no one in his entire empire had ever dared imagine, slowly bringing everything that belonged to the darkness out into the light. He couldn't erase the past overnight, but piece by piece, he transformed his business into legitimate enterprises, closing the dark doors his father had left behind, and every decision he made was another brick removed from the shadowed wall that had imprisoned him since he was a boy. He proved, even to himself, that no matter how deeply a person has fallen, they can still choose to turn toward the light, that the past isn't a life sentence, but a place from which to begin again. Toby grew stronger with each passing day in their new home, his cheeks becoming rosy, his bright laughter echoing through rooms that had once been cold and silent, while he ran through the sunlit garden exactly as he had been promised. In the evenings, he could often be found curled against his sister or sitting beside the tall man, who had now become part of their family, turning the pages of books once owned by the linguist grandfather he had never met, learning new words in distant languages, allowing the voice and spirit of the man who was gone to continue living through the laughter of a child. And that handwritten dictionary, the one that had followed Della through fire, poverty, loneliness, and guilt, the one that had once become the key to revealing the truth and restoring the honor of a father misunderstood for so many years, now found a place of distinction on the bookshelf of their new home, no longer a relic of loss, but a symbol of reunion and healing. One evening, after Toby had fallen deeply asleep, Rafe sat beside Della beneath the warm light, holding the dictionary in his hands, and slowly, carefully, he spoke her father's name aloud, pronouncing every sound clearly and correctly, exactly as she had taught him. And when he did, Della began to cry, tears born from a peace she had once believed she would never know. Because in that moment, the man who had once ruled half the city's darkness was speaking her father's name with complete respect, restoring to the dead man the honor the world had taken from him, and finally closing the circle that had begun on a distant winter night. The story of Della Rourke, the woman the world had once treated as invisible, the woman who had been looked upon as though she were something dragged from the gutter, became the story of the person who taught the most powerful man a lesson no amount of wealth could buy, that human dignity is never measured by the money in someone's pocket or the class into which they were born, but by the courage to raise their voice when everyone else chooses to remain silent and bow their heads. She reminds us that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't authority or violence, but knowledge, self-respect, and a heart that still knows how to love even after it has been broken, that kindness planted in adversity will always find its way home, and that no one, no matter how poor or wounded, is ever undeserving of being seen, respected, and loved as a whole human being. If this story touched your heart, and if you believe that every person, no matter how small they may seem, carries a value that can't be measured, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with the people you love so that together we can spread meaningful and heartwarming stories every day. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. So, what do you think about Della's journey, and which moment in the story moved your heart most deeply? Please leave a comment and tell us about the honest feelings within your heart, because every word you share is a precious source of encouragement that helps us continue bringing you stories that touch the soul. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moment. May you and those you love always be blessed with abundant health, lasting joy, and peace in every passing day of your lives. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.